Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Lee.
Welcome back.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Erika.
And I'm Tonya. And
this is our podcast, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadows of Resistance. And to those of you who have joined us before, you know that in this podcast series, we discuss those issues that prevent us from being socially just or free.
Yeah.
And our goal is to disrupt the status quo, right, of racial inequality and inequity. And in each episode, we challenge each other to do better by being the change that we want to see.
we sure do. Thanks, Erika. So today we want to talk about a topic that we just thought was really interesting, and it's storytelling.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the power of storytelling, but not just for the sake of telling stories, but really so that we begin to see people
Yeah.
for who they are and for the experiences that they bring to the table.
Yeah.
And it really is a tool to understand groups of people.
Yeah, I mean, it creates connection, right? Our
Yeah.
brains are so social, and one of the things that it's drawn to is someone else's story.
Right.
It's the reason why you can sit in class. I remember as a kid, anytime a teacher started with a story or explained, using a story, I was all ears. So I really wanted to hear
Yeah.
the beginning,
Yeah.
what was happening, and how it ended,
Right.
right? And that really is part of the power of
Right.
telling a story.
And the same thing with like reading aloud.
Yeah.
Because there's something about reading aloud to children that makes the story come to life.
Yeah.
And, even it was funny when I taught elementary school, I remember at the kindergarten level, the kids weren't yet readers. So because they weren't readers, then, the teachers often would read to them. By fourth grade, teachers would stop reading to the kids. And the experts and the researchers would say, no, continue doing those read alouds with them. Not because they can't read, but because there's something to it. You would read something that's at a higher level, so maybe like if they were to read it, it might be harder for them to read. But if you're reading it to them, their listening comprehension was much better.
Yeah.
But it allows not just students, but adults as well to really like learn about groups of people.
I think that's it. I think that's it. And I love that you brought out that piece about reading out loud.
Yeah.
My background is literacy, and, what we know is that the receptive vocabulary is higher than the expressive vocabulary. So what I can take in, it's the reason why someone that's, they might be born into a family where they speak another language. So they can understand it, but they may not be able to speak it because they're receptive. And I think that's part of the storytelling, right? So we can understand it, right? And we may not be able to express what we heard. We may not be able to repeat it, but we can understand it. And it's such a great way to connect with kids because kids love the stories, right? They love the stories. And so I also think, in my family, like my parents use stories as a way to teach us, lessons and morals and rules and as a way to explain and history, right?
Yeah.
Like such great stories. And I would want them to like, tell me again, about that. But absolutely.
Yeah. It's funny. I was just saying to you earlier how, I was on a call recently with my dad, and it was like an hour and a half call. And he's telling me these stories, and they're really family history. And what I wanted to do, I didn't do it, and I should have, in hindsight, is I should have grabbed my notebook and just started writing down these stories that he's telling me. And they're hilarious, some of them. I mean, some of the stories were about some of the philandering uncles, And so, like listening to those stories, and I sort of remember these are like, my grandmother's uncles. So I sort of remember some of these uncles, and hearing their stories was just hilarious to me. But it also talked about, what it also did was it got me in touch a little bit with not just the family history, but dynamics between men and women.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
yes.
in decades past, in generations past, and what those dynamics were like,
Yeah.
and what they're like now.
Yeah.
And so it was like really just interesting to just hear him share some of those stories, and he shared other types of stories as well, because he sort of sees himself as like the family historian.
Okay.
Excuse me, which is, you know, very much a part of our culture.
Yes, very much
You know,
so.
but not just, you know, African culture. Like, you know, you may hear of the griot in Africa, and the griot is the storyteller.
Yeah.
And, you know, in different African tribes and communities. And so that griot actually keeps the running history
Yes.
of those families and
communities,
tribes and
yes.
communities. And so, you know, my dad is kind of like that griot. His dad was kind of like that, you know, and would tell stories. And so it's like really important to keep that tradition, because a lot of times you'll hear, you know, like stories are told from different people's vantage points.
Yes.
You know, there's like a point of view. Like, you know, so as Christians, we'll read like the Bible, and we'll read like the 4 Gospels. You know, and the 4 Gospels are really the accounts of Jesus's walk on earth, right? But each of those tell the story a little bit differently.
That's right. Right.
So, you know, you'll hear about, you know, Jesus and feeding the 5,000, but then there's another depiction of him feeding 4,000. You know, but then the way it's written, it's based upon the different people's accounts.
Right.
So it's really interesting because you can learn a lot about people by the way they tell the story,
Sure.
and the details that they include in those stories.
Yeah, yeah. You can learn a lot about their values, like their priorities, right? And how they, you know, and I used to ask my dad, like, well, what did you do? It's like, I didn't do nothing. I was 9 or whatever, you know. But the other thing, especially the family stories, I just loved because I started to see myself. So, you know, this auntie did this or this cousin did this, and it's like, I would have done the same thing. Like, there's a connection there, you know, or almost like the story was told as caution. Like, listen, it looks like you're going down this road. Let me tell you about what happened previously, you know. But you're right, it's absolutely a part of the tradition because it kept, you know, what was always funny to me is that I would, you know, say to an uncle or an aunt or a cousin, my dad told me about this, and they'd be like, that's not how it happened. And then I'd get another version,
Sure.
you know, from another perspective. But it really helped me to see myself in this family.
Yeah.
So how do I fit? You know, how is someone else like what I did, or, you know, or the way I am, or the way I see things? I think it really kind of helped, and it really helped pull us those family stories. Really, we still tell them, my cousins and I, you know, to our kids and to each other, because they're important. They're important, you know.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking about like the way that I see my upbringing, the way my brother and my sister see our upbringing. If we all tell the story, it's all going to be different.
All different.
And it's not like it's a lie.
Yes.
It's just different.
Yes.
But what's interesting about that is we think about history that's taught in school, right? So, you know, the history that's taught in school is some historians' point of view, written in historic form for students to learn.
That's right.
And if we aren't careful, we'll think that that's the only story.
Yes.
That's the only story.
Yes.
That's the only version of that story.
Yeah, that's why it's really important for us to really understand like what dominant narrative means.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and
What
because
does
that's
that mean?
Well, it's the story that's kind of told and it takes over. Right? And that's the one that we kind of accept as, well, this must have been what happened, right? So I remember when I was younger, like hearing about, you know, George Washington, I cannot tell a lie. And remember that one? He chopped down a cherry tree and I cannot tell a lie.
Yes.
Come to find out, that wasn't true. like what? But I had always heard about it. I'd read about it in books, and I'd heard about it in school, and you know how he couldn't. And the narrative was so that we would think or believe that the first president of the United States was this moral, upstanding person. And so this whole thing about I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down a tree, whatever that story was, it really was to create mythology, right? So they used narrative, but they used false narrative, so that there would be sort of this belief around one of the founders of the United States. And so, but that's part of the dominant narrative. So when I started hearing other pieces of the narrative, I realized, kind of like, okay, that's not true. And what the purpose of that was so that, we wouldn't talk about the fact that he was, he owned people, right? That he, victimized and marginalized, enslaved people, being a landowner from Virginia. But when we talk about these other things, and when we can't, we make it up, but I think that's a place where they, again, that's the dominant narrative. These stories that we hear over and over and over again, and it create, belief, and it creates expectations, and it creates really sort of this mythology around, the story that they want to tell.
Right, or that they want people to know.
Right.
It's interesting because as researchers, and I know while you're, finishing your doctorate,
yes.
When I was in my doctoral program, one of the things that we were told was basically, don't believe everything that you read. Like, if you read one thing about, information, content or whatever it is that we're reading about, you need to find everything else that's written about that one thing. Like, what else is written about it? Because therein lies more of the truth of the story of whatever it is that we're learning. So quite honestly, as researchers, we don't just take an article and like, this is fact, this is what it is. If this article said it, this is what. No, we've got to look at the research from all different vantage points.
That's right.
We need to look at what the counter research is and the supportive research, and therein lies, the truth is not the right word, but therein lies like the
just
story.
A full picture.
A fuller picture of what something is. Because the truth is what might be your good story might actually be a bad story for me, So, and we see that even in American history when we look at, there's a narrative out there, which is absurd to me. Oh, well, slavery wasn't so bad. There were some good slave owners, which is just
annoying,
crazy. But it's like, wait a minute, you're talking about subservient marginalization at its worst.
That's
right. There is no good that comes from that.
That's right.
And so, when we think about storytelling, there's an opportunity for counter storytelling as well. Which is like, okay, so there's more to the story than meets the eye. So let's find out. Just like, if an investigator is investigating a crime, one investigator may notice, certain information and may say, okay, this is what I think happened based upon this evidence. I think that, the killer was probably trying to do XYZ because they broke the glass of the home. Whatever. I mean, I'm totally winging this here.
Oh, good.
And then, someone else like, no, I don't think that's what happened. Because they would have done XYZ. Instead, they did this, and I noticed this pattern of behavior, which means that this was probably. So what they're doing is they're piecing the story together based upon the evidence. And there's a lot of evidence to detail all the different stories that are to be told.
And very often, the evidence or the full story comes from other stories or other witnesses. So what's your story around this event?
Right.
What's your story around this event, and what's your story? And then we piece that together and we get the true story, the truth of what happened in this space. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and even when if there's a crime and they interview the different witnesses. So one witness might have been standing on the right, one witness might have been standing on the left. So they saw one thing from their angle and they saw something else from their angle. And, or they heard this because they were closer to these people, but they didn't hear it over here because they weren't so close. And so we really have to do a better job even in this country, of thinking that like there's only one story to be told.
That's right.
About groups of people.
That's right.
Which is really where we're going with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think, because we've had conversations about like, so how do we overcome, like how do we get to a place where, different groups, don't feel marginalized by each other, or they just get along better. Sure. And I think storytelling is one of those strategies, right? So
it is.
When you start to tell me your story, I start to connect, you know.
I'm humanized.
That's
at that
right.
point.
That's right. And I start to really like I can see how that happened, or wow, I can't believe you did that. Tell me a little bit more about what you were thinking.
Right.
Those kinds of conversations that just kind of pull us in and bring us together. And I think sometimes when we're afraid to share our story, or when somebody else might be afraid to tell us, it really sort of creates barriers, or it creates like gaps and gulfs where maybe it could be, sort of brought together by, but just by a great story,
absolutely.
And we all have them.
Right.
We all have them.
Right. Yeah, and it really does give us insight.
Yes.
Into
each other.
Into each other, who people, and so, when we think about, because we often talk about race and racism and, some of the historical challenges we've had in our country. And so, when we think about the stories that have been told about Black people, over the years, and I'm talking like something that predates us. So, a group of uncivilized people, like when you think about like some of the stories that were told about Africans, before bringing them here, like as though bringing them to this shore was a favor because they were living in uncivilized, society, and they needed, that, if you will. Like those stories, unfortunately, are really negative stories, but they're also stories that dehumanized us. Yes. And stories, that, when you look at, years ago, there was a movie that came out under Woodrow Wilson, I believe, was president, The Birth of a Nation. And it was an extremely racist movie that told a really racist, stereotypical, nasty story about Black people being savages and violent and rapists and, and the list goes on. And so then that gave permission to people to basically say, well, if they're savages, if they're not human, if they're violent, then it's nothing for us to harm them.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And hurt them.
That's right.
And so, and we're justified in doing so. And that's what would happen. But we understand what that was doing. Yes. Now we understand that. And I feel like we have a responsibility to get rid of stories that dehumanize groups of people.
Yes, I think that's so important. Years ago, when I was working for a state agency, I worked for a board, and there was an opportunity to go to like a museum. There was a lecture or something like that for the board, so we coordinated and we went. And later, I asked one of the board members, who was a white woman, what did you think about, how did it go? And her words to me were, I just learned so much. I did not realize that there was culture in Africa before people got on ships. That's what she said. People got on ships. And her words were, they weren't just waiting around to get on a boat.
Wow.
Whoa! I would have just never thought at that time that there would be somebody that would think that, right?
Wow.
But she went somewhere. She got this information. Somebody was really good about sharing it, and I'm glad. But it was just like, that was the first time that I realized that everybody didn't get the same kinds of information around history. Everybody didn't get that like I did around particularly my history. That really floored me. But I think though, the more that and I didn't oh my God, how could you just tell me more, about your experience and everything like that. But I think that it's like that giving and that getting grace, is really important. But I'm glad she told me her story. I'm glad she told me what her experience was.
Sure.
Because then I realized that everybody did not have the same experiences that I did. Even on elemental level, like, why wouldn't you assume that there was culture in Africa? Why would you assume that somebody wanted to get on a boat to be enslaved? But not everybody was there. And so we were able to have that conversation. So I think making sure that we're really clear and just really gracious about not canceling people, but having these conversations and telling our story and sharing our stories, I think is important.
Yeah, I think that was a really good example. I think about when I was a kindergarten teacher, and kids love story time. They absolutely loved when we would gather on the rug. It was like a really special moment. But it was an opportunity to really just open up a world to those students, to see something beyond. And sometimes we were reading, fairy tales, and they weren't real, but it would open up a world, open up dialogue, conversation around topics that otherwise they may not have, because you've opened up a book. If you remember reading Rainbow, like the theme song, and right. But it was really, the theme song was about I can't remember the exact words of the theme song, but it was something around, opening up the possibilities and it's really in those stories that we grow as a people. The more I read, and I've got more books than I can read right now. But the more I read, the more I learn.
Yes.
And I learn, there are things that I learned that I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea. I just did not know this about whatever the topic is. And so, we've got to get to a place in society where we help people rather than ban books. We need to open up opportunities for there to be, more exposure to the stories of people's lives.
Yeah, that is so true. I had I remember when I was teaching, every single unit that I started off with a story. It was usually a story about my life, and so there was one time, especially my argument essay unit, I started off by kind of sharing how I got these tickets to go see Prince. Oh my God, they were free. I stood in line. It was cold outside. I was freezing. I just wanted to see his royal badness, And I got these tickets, but and I got the tickets. So the DJs, we were at this place where you could get these free tickets, and he would be like, who has something? Or it was so I got these tickets, got close enough. I answered the question, got the tickets, me and my best friend, Shreya. And the concert was on a Thursday night. And my mom and dad had strict rules about not going out on a school night. But I was 16, 17, and I was a good student. So I was like, Mom, I got tickets. And she hated Prince anyway. So she was like, no. And I was like, what? And so she's like, it's a school night. But for her, it was good, because now, my daughter's not going to go be infected by this artist, Right. And so anyway, so I didn't go. But I started with that story because so what would have been the argument that I could have used to craft to convince my mother? And so, but that always kind of got the discussion, and kids were always into it. You really didn't go? Why didn't you go? And it was. That's
what I'm thinking the same thing. She did not let you go.
She did not let me go.
Did you sell the tickets?
I sold the ticket to somebody else who had a fabulous time, and still to this day, and I didn't. I didn't. Thursday. It was a Thursday evening. My parents were like, "Yeah, no, it's a school night." I'm like, but it's Friday. No learning happens on Friday.
Of course not.
Oh no. And that was, but no, I didn't go. Yeah. I didn't go. It was years later that I saw Prince.
Wow.
On a Wednesday night, but I was in my 20s. But yeah, but like starting off with the story was really important.
Yeah.
So that kids got the concept,
Right.
and that they started to be invested, right? And I think that's what happens when you tell a story. People get invested,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because
Right.
we humanize each other, and my students saw that. I had some of the same challenges around permission and socializing and going to do what I want to do that they were having. And I think that that's really part of the goal, really, in
Sure.
storytelling, right?
Right,
You
right.
want people invested in the story,
Yes.
right? So we can't get to the next part if we don't tell our story.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really good. And storytelling is very cultural.
It is,
So I mean,
very
we're
much
talking
so.
about like the griot and African culture, but other cultures also tell stories.
Yes.
And they tell them. Sometimes they're like mythical stories, and they may not even be real. Or sometimes the stories may speak to their tradition. So we see this in indigenous
Yeah.
communities. We see this in Asian communities, Baltic communities, Latin communities. I mean, like this is not unique.
It's human.
Right?
Very human.
It's very much a part of who we are as people,
Yeah.
and we have an opportunity to really share our world
Yes.
with other people.
Yes.
When we
Yes.
become storytellers, and when we share those stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because when you look at like ancient cultures, and no, I don't have the exact like culture, but when you look at ancient cultures, I'm trying to think of the culture, but anyway, I watch a lot of documentaries, but they talk about how sort of the beginning of the arts in that culture was really around stories, right? So telling the story, people would go from community to community, telling stories. And even sort of the arts, like the visual arts, is really around the pictorial representation of those stories, right? And so, that's how elemental in a lot of cultures that storytelling is. Like whole communities of artists were built on it, right? And so, but I think it goes back to like what you were saying, like it's not necessarily universal because not every culture has the same kind of emphasis on storytelling.
Sure.
But definitely we see it like spanning,
Right.
more than one culture, the importance and the value
across
of
generations.
it. Absolutely.
Yeah. When I think about this whole notion of storytelling, and how polarized we are
Yeah.
in our country, I really believe storytelling could potentially be an answer to that ill. If we sat down and talked to people.
Yeah.
And learned about who they were and their families and their culture and their experiences and their history, we really have an opportunity to connect with people in ways that we otherwise may not have connected. It's almost like, how people have like different types of parties or events or whatever. It's almost like we need a storytelling, like a cross culture kind of event where we get to hear from, and this is just an idea.
Yeah, I think that's great.
But like, what if we brought groups of people together to share their stories?
Yeah.
How powerful would that be?
Yes. I think that would be marvelous. And I think people would really get into it as well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's that really is sort of the crux of entertainment, right? People want to watch a story.
Right. A good story.
A good story, right? So I think that's I love that idea. And maybe we can sort of like flesh that out and really kind of bring people together to tell their stories.
Sure.
So this has been a really great conversation.
It
like,
has been.
In terms of, the power of storytelling. We invite you to share your story with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
We would love to hear your story around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, or even a great story that you heard or that you've shared in the past.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
That would be wonderful.
So thank you for joining us.
Yes.
Again, I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika.
And we would love to have you come back and talk to us again.
Yes.
Or we'll talk to you.
Take care, everybody.